Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now this is a used Zoo Storm pre-built PC. It's a great place to start if you want to get into PC gaming because it's easily upgradable. We've got an Asus motherboard in here which supports anything from a Celeron to an i7 on the 1150 socket, the potential for 16GB of DDR3 RAM, and best of all, the power supply is of standard form factor so it can be replaced. I used this machine as the basis for my Call of Duty Warzone minimum requirements gaming build. In this series we build a PC tailored to the minimum requirements of one specific game, something that should never really be done, and then see how well the PC runs said game as well as a few others. So Call of Duty Warzone, according to the developers, requires an Intel i3-4340 or FX 6300, 8GB of RAM and a GTX 670, Radeon HD 7950 or GTX 1650. We've gone for the Intel and Nvidia approach as used parts from both respective companies tend to be cheaper. All I did was swap out the i3-4130 that came with this PC for a 4340, add another 4GB stick of matching 1600MHz memory, add the graphics card and of course replace the power supply. The original was a 250 watt rated unit which might power something like a GTX 1050, but it isn't worth the risk with anything else. It also has no PCIe connectors anyway, so not much else can be used. The good old Be Quiet System Power 9 has taken its place. Now the difference between an i3-4130 and 4340 is probably negligible and isn't a worthwhile upgrade, but I wanted to do this properly after all. I'll also have a more in-depth video with regards to the GTX 670 inside this machine, just to check out its full potential, but for now, all you need to know is that it has 2GB of VRAM, which might pose a problem. The card is however still supported by the latest Nvidia drivers at the time of this video, version 445.87. Now you may have also noticed that this PC has no rear fan, which you should definitely have. Mine just got lost in transit, or as I like to call it, stolen in the post. Always make sure your PC has adequate airflow, especially if using older, hotter components. So let's get started. Call of Duty Warzone is an FPS title, so the closer to 60 frames per second you can get, the better. The settings I've gone with reflect this. So what do you need to do to achieve 60 FPS? Well, there's nothing you can do really. I started off at 1080p with the lowest in-game settings, and even so, 60 FPS was an impossible target. In all fairness, Activision do state that for 60 FPS you'll need an i5 or Ryzen 5, as well as a more powerful GPU. The components I've used are described as the minimum specs that are needed to play, and they're not wrong, the game will run, but it's not a very good experience to be honest. The CPU and GPU are both struggling, but you will still get at least 30 frames per second, and sometimes you'll exceed 40. It also looks quite bad in some areas, though enemy players are still pretty clear to see. So the next step is a drop in resolution, right? Well, that didn't really work either. The CPU started to sweat a little more, and it never really had much breathing room anyway, so the frame rate won't really change. The same can be said for 720p. But all hope is not lost. Let's see what else it can do, because the i3 and 670 should still work together quite well in a few instances, or at least work better than COD. Red Dead Redemption 2 at 900p will return at least 30 frames per second. The game actually feels quite smooth with a few frame drops here and there, though don't look too closely at the texture work. You can pretty much turn everything else up if you wanted to and not exceed the VRAM limit, or you can remove the limit yourself in your documents. This will cause some problems though, and this combination is best suited to the low preset at a lower resolution. GTA 5, which is more demanding than Red Dead Redemption on the processor, ran very nicely at 1080p with the normal settings. The i3 is probably holding the 670 back a bit today in most titles, but despite this we were still seeing at least 60 frames per second, with this game on average. The game still looks good, even at normal, which is pretty much this game's equivalent to the low settings, so if you have these specs or are looking for a pairing that will play GTA 5 trouble-free, then the 4340 and 670 should suffice. Online gameplay may vary depending on what you are doing, of course. Fortnite gave us a pretty good average frame rate and sometimes exceeded 100 FPS at low. The low settings may have been a bit unnecessary, but I was hoping to eliminate some of the stutter that I experienced. As you can see by the 0.1% low figure, there were quite a few drops here and there. Again, I'd say that the CPU is at fault. 2 cores and 4 threads just don't seem to be enough a lot of the time these days. It's certainly a better result than we get with just 2 cores, but a quad-core chip or better is certainly the way to go. Even a used i5 4460 would be a much better choice, and perhaps even a Ryzen 3 1200 on the AM4 platform should be considered. Fallout 4 at high settings ran okay, there were some drops below 60 but nothing too noticeable. I did leave the FPS cap in place to avoid any problems here, though even by removing it I don't think we'd exceed it by too much. I'd consider this one playable with these specs. Again, the i3 is the problem. They can be picked up for quite a good price these days though, so if you want to play older games or don't mind perhaps capping the titles you do want to play to 30 FPS, then it might be alright. Again, my recommendation would have to be an i5 if you have an 1150 socket motherboard, or an i7 with 4 cores and 8 threads, as it will really help out. Finally, we have Shadow of the Tomb Raider. I ran the benchmark here at 1080p with the low settings, and I thought this would be a good place to stop to avoid sounding like a broken record. To be fair, the i3 isn't the only problematic component though. The GTX 670 is struggling, and don't forget we are also using 8GB of RAM, which in some titles may not be enough at higher settings. In the case of this machine though, we were mainly using lower settings and the i3 was more of a problem than the memory. The 2GB of VRAM will also prevent you from making use of higher texture settings, Red Dead 2 being a primary example, as well as COD Warzone. So the COD Warzone PC isn't really fit to actually run Call of Duty Warzone. It's a bit disappointing, but it was sort of what I was expecting, to be honest. Remember, we do this to see how accurate minimum requirements really are, and then dedicate the rest of the video to working out what specific hardware can do in certain instances. In the case of these parts, there will certainly be some issues, though you should be able to get away with running some games relatively problem-free, especially if you don't mind those lower settings and a lower resolution. Let's conclude. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, on occasion you say 30 FPS is playable, why would you not consider it playable here? Well, to be honest, I think from what I've got in terms of feedback from you guys, games like this, first person shooters, are generally better played at 60 frames per second, you know? I think 30 FPS is playable, don't get me wrong, you know, growing up with consoles, I've always thought 30 FPS is fine, but for a fast-paced action game like this, it's clear that most of you guys would rather achieve 60 frames per second. So if a game like this isn't getting 60 frames per second, then it's very hard to recommend the components. If you are looking for a 1080p 30 FPS experience, then yes, the i3 in combination with a 670 will suit you perfectly fine with 8GB of RAM. But bear in mind there are going to be a few stutters, so it's not always about the average frame rate, but the stutters and frame drops and freezes should also be considered as well. The i3 4340 to me is still an okay CPU. You know, when it comes to internet browsing, things like that, it's going to feel pretty snappy even under Windows 10. Some games will run absolutely fine. I mean, Red Dead Redemption 2 for some reason still runs fine on this dual-core 4-threaded chip. It could do with being paired with a better graphics card. It just depends on whether or not the game is more CPU or GPU intensive. You also have to factor in the aforementioned 670. It's a 2GB card, which in 2020 can struggle. You know, that 2GB of VRAM, you could have the most powerful graphics card in the world. Imagine the GTX 1080 Ti. I know we're going back a few years now, but imagine if that had 2GB of VRAM, it would be next to useless in a lot of these demanding games. It's got the power, but the VRAM is holding it back. The 670 doesn't really have the power or enough VRAM anymore. But there is a 4 gig version of the card. I'm not sure how much better that would do. Activision weren't specific with the 670, whether or not they meant a 2 gig or 4 gig card, but I think power wise the 670 is going to struggle anyway. It's an older card. I don't know whether or not that 4 gig card would do any better, to be honest, in modern games like this. Either way, I've had an absolute blast testing this system. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I really do like making these budget gaming builds, even though they don't always work out too well, but that's all I can really say, and on that terrible disappointment, it is time to end. Okay, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like on it, leave a dislike if you didn't, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one, when we'll be taking a look at the remastered version of Mafia 2.